This message comes to you from King's Church Wirral, UK. We hope that as you listen, you will be encouraged, blessed and inspired.
Hello, welcome to this teaching from King's Church Wirral. We're currently in the middle of a teaching series looking at images and metaphors of the church from the Bible. As we're doing this, we are asking the question, what must we as a church change in or step into in order to be all that God wants his church to be? So far, we have looked at church as a body, with each part finding its value and its place functioning within the whole under Christ as the head. We've looked at church as a field where God brings growth. We've looked at church as the temple, as the dwelling place of God. And we've looked at church as citizens of heaven, being resident of one place whilst being citizens of another. Today I'm going to be looking at a metaphor from the end of the book of Ezekiel, which is the church as a river. Ezekiel is a book absolutely steeped in metaphor, poetry and imagery. Ezekiel himself was a judge in the temple of God in Jerusalem who was exiled into Babylon by the Babylonians because of the rebellion of Israel. So he finds himself existing just as Ian spoke about, as a resident of one land but a citizen of another. He was resident in Babylon, but his heart longed for the wonder of Jerusalem. Psalm 137, which was probably written by the prophet Jeremiah at a similar time during the exile, begins with the lament that would have matched the heart of Ezekiel and the pain felt by Ezekiel when he says, "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion." This feeling of being in exile in a foreign land is repeated when talking of the people of God in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 11. Speaking of the people of God, it says, "They admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth." People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. So Ezekiel finds himself a long way from home, and more importantly, a long way from the dwelling place of the God of Israel, which would have been the dwelling place of the God of Israel, the place where he was stationed, was above the Ark of the Covenant in the inner sanctuary of the temple. Now, the end of the book of Ezekiel has this image of the river, which we're going to get to. But to fully understand the significance of the image, we have got to understand what Ezekiel has said up to this point, and how this whole story is a foreshadowing of the work of God through Jesus. The book starts in Ezekiel 1 with Ezekiel having a vision. He sees a vision of God on a chariot surrounded by angels. He declares that at the end of chapter 1 that he's looking at the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. In Hebrew, the word that is translated glory literally translates as weight or heaviness. And it's used to denote the physical manifestation or physical moving of God. It's when God demonstrates in the real world his who he is and what he's about. Now, this necessarily for a prophet, this was not an unusual idea. The glory of God was known. It was known that it was in the temple. What is unusual about this is that he sees this image of God in Babylon. And I don't mean he sees the image of God while he is in Babylon. I mean he sees the chariot, the glory of God, stationed in Babylon. What is the presence of God doing in Babylon? The next few chapters really explain why. Through other visions and images, he sees the sin of Israel, their idol worship, their acts of social injustice, their disregard of the poor. And God brings about, over a few chapters, multiple accusations against Israel that Ezekiel acts out in all sorts of ways. He lies on his side in the city. He builds a little model of the city that he lays siege to, including he's instructed to eat food that has been cooked over burning human poo, to demonstrate the way that Israel has defiled herself and moved away from the teachings and directions of God. And this all culminates in a vision of idol worship within the temple courts. And then in chapter 10, the moment comes when he sees the same chariot with the glory of God leave the temple and head to Babylon. Now, this might seem all very odd, but the end of all this is this. When God sent his people into exile as a punishment for their sin, idolatry, and defilement, he went with them. His glory, the physical presence of God, his glory left the temple and went into Babylon with them. This image of God moving into exile with his people is so clear a foreshadowing of the incarnation in Jesus. Ephesians says, Christ, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death. Death is our exile. But when we go into exile, God comes with us in order to bring us out of exile. John says it like this in his biography of Jesus in chapter 1. He says it like this: the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among them. In the Message translation, he moved into the neighborhood. Just as he did in Ezekiel, as the glory departed from the temple and went with his people into exile in Babylon, so too did God come to his people on earth in the form of Jesus and dwelt with sinful human in our spiritual exile. Following this, the remainder of the book of Ezekiel follows a pattern of 3 acts of judgment followed by 3 prophecies of hope. Firstly, judgment on Israel, when through many images Israel is compared to a burnt, useless branch, an adulterous wife, a dangerous lion, and in actually one of the more visceral passages of the Bible in chapter 23, compared to 2 promiscuous sisters. God concludes with the fact what this whole image of judgment is evident within the law court where Ezekiel comes through and stands as judge. He is within the law court declaring that this exile, this judgment is deserved. Next comes judgment on the nations. So the first image is a judgment of Israel. The next is a judgment of the nations, where God uses the images of Egypt and Tyre, 2 great nations of the day, and declares that they have set themselves against his people, and he's going to bring destruction on them. Now, this is more than a specific act against a specific nation, though. It is a declaration to all nations that they have not heeded or honoured the people of God or listened to them, but rather set themselves against them and deserve judgment. So we have judgment on Israel, judgment on the nations, and then finally in chapter 23 comes the news that Jerusalem has fallen and the judgment against the city is complete and the temple has been destroyed. judgment on Israel, judgment on the nations, and judgment on Jerusalem. Now, this all seems pretty bleak, and not, maybe, what you had hoped for when I was going to talk about the church being a nice river. But you have to understand that in order to appreciate the hope that this image brings for all people and all creation, it is set against a backdrop of utter hopelessness. The glory has departed from the temple. Israel and its people are under God's judgment. The city and the temple have been destroyed. But in the midst of this is the reminder that the glory of God is with his people in exile. So then comes the hope for the story. Now, looking back, knowing the fulfillment of this in the person of Jesus of Nazareth, this is so exciting. It's like watching a great film when you already know the end. One of those films where it looks like the bad guy's winning and it's all going wrong, all going terribly, but you know the good guy's going to win. And then that moment comes in the film where it turns on itself and you start seeing the victory coming. It is against this backdrop of deep despair and darkness, just before the good guy gets up and beats the enemy. It's against that backdrop that these images of hope come through. The first image that comes through is hope for Israel. And all three of these images are necessary to understand the purpose of the river. The first is an image of hope for Israel. God says he is going to raise up a new David, a messianic leader who will give his people a new heart, indwelt with God's Spirit. This imagery that's used in the chapter harks back to the creation story. Ezekiel has a vision of being in a valley of dry bones, a metaphor for the exile and death of the people. But into that, the breath of God comes, and the bones are reanimated, covered in skin, and brought back to life. God is saying that he is going to reform and recreate man in a way that gives them a new heart, makes them capable of living in a relationship of love with their Creator. Now we know this new David to be Jesus. And we know this new recreated man to be God's church, filled with the breath or the Spirit of God as his recreated people. Next, an image of hope for the nations. The book uses a symbol of an ancient king from Genesis 10 called Gog, who symbolizes all the evil of the world. But in this image, Gog is finally defeated. Now again, this is not a statement against a particular people or against a particular king. It is a symbol of all of human rebellion. And what God is saying through this image is human rebellion can be brought to an end, so that all nations, not just Israel, but all nations can be welcomed into relationship with the Father. This image is fulfilled, this final image is fulfilled in Revelation chapter 7, where John sees an image of the people of God from every nation, tribe, people and language before the throne of the Lamb. And it says they were wearing white robes and held palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to the Lamb who sits on the throne." Where once Israel were able to be close, but other nations were in rebellion, now all nations are drawn close. And then finally, Ezekiel sees an image of a new temple, greater and more majestic than the one destroyed. And this same chariot from Ezekiel 1 which was in Babylon, with the glory of God, the same chariot that departed the temple in Ezekiel 10, with the glory of God, that same glory of God comes and rests in the new temple of Ezekiel 46. The new temple, God's temple, the dwelling place of God. This temple, in the image, is set within a city. But this man, Ezekiel, who has longed for Jerusalem, does not declare that this temple is in Jerusalem, but rather, at the end of Ezekiel 48, declares that the name of the city is "The Lord is there." As was shared by Colin in a previous video, we, the Church of Jesus, are that temple. We are the dwelling place of God. In 2 Corinthians 6:16, Paul, who was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a Jew of Jews, who knew this stuff inside and out, who was a Pharisee, trained in the law and understanding of the prophets. Paul, when he writes to the church in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians 6:16, he says this: "We are the temple of the living God, as God has said." And then he quotes Ezekiel 37. I will live with them and walk among them. I will be their God and they will be my people. He quotes this image of the temple from Ezekiel 37 and declares we the church are that temple, the dwelling place of God, where God is our God and we are his people. So finally, after the story of a Messiah coming to the people in exile, to the nations being restored with a new heart, and evil being defeated, and the dwelling place of God resting on man and establishing a new temple, Ezekiel has a vision that is the title of this video. He sees a river flowing out of the temple. This is what it says. The man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me through the north gate and led me around the outside to the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and then led me through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. He led me through measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was up to the waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. He asked me, "Son of man, do you see this?" Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, "This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live." What a fantastic line. Where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore. From El Gedi to El Eglaim, there will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. But the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They'll be left for the salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fall. Every month they will bear fruit, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. So coming out of the temple, which we have seen Paul is clear in the New Testament, is the New Testament people of God as his church, made up from people from all nations with no racial barrier to intimacy and closeness to the Father. Out of that a river that grows and grows and grows. It starts a trickling stream only ankle deep, and it grows. It becomes waist deep. Sorry, it becomes knee deep, and it grows. Then it becomes waist deep, and it grows. Then so deep, wide, and mighty that it cannot be resisted or swam against. Now I want to tell you, if you are of the opinion that the church is going to be beaten back by the darkness of this world until only a weak, disparate, desperate entity exists, at which point Jesus will return to rescue a faithful remnant. If you believe that, you can. But know that you are standing against what God says of his church. The church of God is not one that gets smaller, dried up, easier to withstand, but one that gets greater and larger and more influential until it is a raging torrent. But this is not the church growing for the sake of power. No. This is it growing for the sake of bringing life to the world that it is flowing through. Trees grow on its banks. When it enters the Dead Sea, the Dead Sea is so called because it is so salty that no marine life can live. There's no frogs, there's no fish, not even grass or seaweed can grow. Its water burns your eyes if you're submerged in it. Now, no amount of natural flowing water could ever stop the Dead Sea being dead. It's 8 times more salty than the ocean. This is an image, in this metaphor, this is an image of the evil and death, sin. It's exactly where the river flowing from the temple, you see, when it hits the waters, it pushes back the saltiness. It pushes back the death. And life is brought to a place that was impossible for life to be. Fish return, life is restored, and all as an act of the Church of God moving in the world, bringing the influence of the kingdom wherever it goes. More than that, fruit trees grow along its banks. Not fruit trees that grow once a year, like most fruit trees do, that bring their fruit once a year, but fruit in all seasons. Fruit that is good for food. And it says the leaves do not wither, leaves that bring healing. Now, what a wonderful end to the book of Ezekiel. So much despair, so much lament, so much heartache as God speaks judgment. But then the Messiah. Then the renewed people of God. Then the restoration of the nations. Then the establishment of the new temple. And then the river, bringing life to death as it flows out of the dwelling place of God and on into the world. Now, as a church, just think about what would be true if we could get this. A church that lives out being the temple and whose actions and motions seek to live up to the metaphor of a river flowing into the world around us, bringing life, joy, growth and fruit to a dead world. Now, if you're joined with us at Kings, I would encourage you to seek God as to what this looks like. You know, there is a lot of scope, a lot of very good stuff about how to bring people into church or how to bring things into church. But this metaphor is clear that it is about going out into the world. What does that look like for you? How are you going to join the flow of the river that impacts the community and the world for the sake of the plans and purposes of God? Thanks for listening.
We hope that you've been blessed by this message. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at www.kingschurchwirral.co.uk.